Hello, this is Benjamin Kennedy, and this is the 10-year retrospective of all the Gamaeyong costumes that I've used to bring Gamaeyong to life. But there are some that will be covered in this retrospective that actually never made it to film for various reasons, and we'll go over why that is. So we're starting off here with some test footage of the original Gamaeyong costume, which at the time was under construction. I was working on getting my GED so I could have my high school equivalent uh, education degree, and I used making the costume as sort of a de-stressor. You can see here that basically I almost had it finished in terms of the basic body at this point. The neck would end up being revised at a certain point. This neck was not the final neck. And I would add all the dragon scales and stuff over the course of about the next year or so. So here's another test I'm doing, and you can see that the revised neck is there, and I've got the head connected. The head was made starting with a cardboard base, which gave some form to the head, gave it a nice solid base, and I just glued it together using some foam and fabric glue, the spray adhesive. And after that, I layered about 2 inches worth of 1-inch foam over them. And you can see at this point, Gamaeyong had sort of a beard, like a bearded dragon at the end of his cheeks there. The mouth or lower jaw ended up being a lot different in the final version, but it's because I felt that when we started getting to the point of latexing it, I didn't like how big the lower jaw was, but I kind of regret that now. I kind of like the character that the lower jaw has here, but well, that was what I thought at the time, so I went with it. This was also probably the only Gamaeyong costume I succeeded in having light up eyes. I always loved the light up eyes of the Gamera monsters and Yongari and monsters like that. And I wanted that for Gamaeyong too, but it's kind of a difficult thing to do, especially when you're trying to get eyeballs and stuff like that. And there are people who have done it and they have tutorials up, but it's kind of beyond my level of expertise. This method I used here was fairly simple. It's just a puck LED light that I installed in the head using kind of a cut up light tray. It's like those plastic trays that you use for putting lights into a roof or the roof of the building. Actually, you can see it. You can see the plastic thing right there in the torso. I used the same thing to mount it in the torso, so you can see it there. And you can just get those from Home Depot in the light department. And I used Velcro to keep the lights from falling out of the plastic little containers. So as to the makeup of this particular costume, it was made almost completely out of 1-inch foam, which in certain places I built up a bit. So in the end, the costume was like thicker than that in some places. It was 2 inches thick on the back. There's a 2-inch slab of foam that is on the very back, which is being used to support the dorsal fins. The feet and the fins are made out of an ultra firm foam that I believe is used in marine purposes. And I was kind of lucky that I had enough left to do this. But in terms of the feet, I used that ultra dense foam, and I cut holes out for my feet right in the middle of the foot, and I had to cut it out entirely because otherwise it was very uncomfortable. I had to cut it out entirely, and then I added a 1-inch piece of foam to the bottom for some support. which it wasn't very much support, and it hurt to stand on the ground. But I didn't really know how to do anything else back then. So here's another test shot. This is around the time that my dad was helping me to finish it up. He helped me cut out a lot of scales and to do the finishing touches like latexing it and painting it. If I hadn't had him to help, it probably would have taken me a few weeks to do that, maybe even a month, because it was very difficult for me at that time. And for some reason, that particular year, my allergies were really reacting to the latex badly, and I just got dizzy using it. So I was very slow, but he was very quick. So we managed to get it done in like a day or two. It would have taken me forever. So here it is all latexed up, and you can see the bottom jaw changed. We changed that out at the last second because I just felt like the lower jaw was too big, and I thought it made him look like a fish, and I didn't want him to look like a fish at that point. So I made the lower jaw flat. I'm not sure if that was a mistake or not in retrospect, but it looks good either way. And here we are. I'm getting the costume on. This is the first day of filming, so it's the first time I really put the costume on, and it was kind of heavy. It wasn't too heavy. The biggest problem actually was that I didn't make the shoulders very well, and so the costume would sag down on me, and all the weight was just coming down on my shoulders, and that was very uncomfortable to have to wear. You can see I can barely put it on by myself. My dad had to help me with the costume because it was just difficult to maneuver. This clip here is after the first series of takes, and I was already really sweaty.
Here's a wet pen. Life of a suit actor.
Of course, I went right back in and we did more takes, but at this point I had to take a break. But you can see here that it actually looked pretty good in the end. The colors we used were called Atomic Red and Atomic Tangerine, and I actually did not have any design or any color scheme laid out before I was making the costume. We finished latexing it, and then my dad went out with my mom and they went to Home Depot, and he listed some paint names, and he happened to find Atomic Red and Atomic Tangerine in them. And being a Godzilla fan, when you hear the word atomic and you're building a monster costume, you instantly go, oh yeah, gee, yeah, it's like, that's it's like, it's meant to be. So that's why I chose him. And I'm glad I did, because that helped me come up with making Gamaeyong a volcanic monster, because he looked like a very hot monster. And so then we were able to make the movie, and it was able to be nice, and I had a monster where it's like I can pretty easily make storylines around him because his concept is really easy to understand. So here's the first of the ultimately unused costumes that I worked on. This was 2014. This was just after Gamaeyong's counterattack, and unfortunately, the first suit unrepairably fell apart after we filmed that. In fact, it was falling apart during the shooting. You can see it falling apart during the end battle with Euphora. So I had to construct a new costume, and this was actually a pretty good attempt, but I let my perfectionism get in the way, and I kind of ruined it after these pictures to an extent where it's like I couldn't use it. Uh, but it's like that ended up being for the better because this construction was too complex, and it was ultimately going to be too expensive, as I would find out later, and too bulky. So it ended up being for the better that it wasn't finished, but it ended up not finished just because I overworked it and overstressed and overthought it. It probably would have gotten close to completion if I hadn't done that. It did, however, give me some practice with making the monster scales from clay and molding them and making them in latex and stuff, so that would serve me well for the next one. So now we're in 2015, 2016. Basically, it was a span of over a year, almost 2 years, I was working on this particular iteration, and it was my most ambitious Gamaeyong costume at that point because I was really trying to make it in the way that the professionals in Japan make it, or at least as close to that as I could get. And so I ended up making the entire thing out of 2-inch foam and layering that over a body form that was made from sweat clothes that we had sewn together and stuffed. And once I built it up on each part, I would carve it and try to get the shapes that I wanted. And I ended up being actually pretty good at it in retrospect, but again, I was too perfectionist at the time and I thought it was terrible at it. But I did end up getting it to the point where it was basically done. Like, I had all the latex scales applied and everything. It was painted, it was ready to go, it was literally done. And then the very day that I put the final touches on it, it fell apart. And it fell apart because all I knew to use at the time was the spray fabric and foam adhesive. And it does a good job for basic things, but as I found, it just stays tacky all the time, and it never solidified. So when I finally finished it, which was sometime during some really hot season, it was hot and humid. The glue finally just became liquid again, and the whole thing just fell apart. I didn't know how to seal the seams at that point. I didn't know that was even a thing you could do. So that's how that costume had its downfall. So it ended up just being thrown in the garbage basically, but I kept the head, and you may recognize the head from Gamaeyong All Monsters Counterattack Directive. It was the Monster Mangara, so I got some use out of it anyway. Now, I never attempted to do it this way again because at a certain point I realized that for a small independent movie, it was too much time to spend on it, it was too much money, too many resources going into something that uh, you would hope to use for a long time in the future, but if you didn't do it right, then it would just fall apart and you'd have wasted all those materials. So I started trying to figure out a better, more economic way to do it. So now we're getting into 2017, 2018, and the pictures we're seeing now are of a costume that I was working on before I ended up with the final costume. This was going okay until I made the mistake of detailing it in a way where it's like I just ended up using scissors to essentially carve the scales into the foam. and that was a very tiring technique. I got tired of it very quickly, and there was a certain point when I just couldn't bring myself to do it anymore. So then I moved on to the costume that did end up in the film, and initially it wasn't supposed to be as detailed as it was, but I got really caught up in doing it, and ended up taking over a year to complete it because of that. Unlike the other costumes, which were made out of much thicker foams, I made this one entirely out of half-inch foam. That was to both decrease the weight and increase the flexibility and make it a lot easier to put together as well. So basically, I had all the different parts, I put them together. Uh, Basically, what I did was I just measured the circumference of all of my body parts, and I doubled that when I went to foam, and I was able to make all the pieces like that. Now you can see all the detail I put into the scales, uh, which is another reason it took so long, because when you just cut them out, they're just smooth strips of foam essentially, which can do the job, but I was really obsessive at that time, and so I wanted it to look really rough and real. So I took the time to like put all the little potholes and wrinkles and whatnot into every single scale. So after I had adhered all the scales to the costume, then I went through and I spent a lot of time cutting all the imperfections into the scales to make them look this rough and detailed and real. And it took quite a while and was quite tiring. Uh, I wouldn't do it again, even if you paid me. It was enjoyable, but it was really tiring, and I wouldn't do it again. The one thing you have to realize about doing a costume that's this detailed and this obsessive is that you have to sacrifice a lot to be able to get the time to do that. You have to skip time with your family members or friends you may like to hang out with. You're not going to have a whole lot of time to play video games or just rest in general. So I wouldn't really suggest going this far with it unless you really just don't want a life outside of making the costume. Uh, the one thing I've learned after all these monster suits is that no matter how well you try to put them together, as I did with this one, is like by this time I had learned, how to seal the seams with the non-toxic weldwood contact cement, and I, sealed all the seams. I sealed the costume with it before we latexed it and everything, so it was a lot better construction. But if you don't know what you're doing with each part, there's always some part that can sort of trip you up and make the costume unusable after a short period of time. In this case, it was the back plate that closed up the costume, which the dorsal plates were on. I used Velcro to close it up, and I also put these hooks on the back of the costume to help keep it closed. And they worked initially, but as time wore on, they just worked less and less, especially the Velcro. And it essentially became unusable after the shooting of All Monsters Counterattack Directive. It just wouldn't stick anymore, and uh, compared to trying to make a new costume, it was too difficult to try and repair. If you do lots of detail like this, another issue is that as the scales start peeling off with age, you face a monumental task in keeping it in good shape. So now we're in 2019 to 2020, and this costume I actually went through the trouble of making patterns for, and I put it together. Well, you can see how I put it together because there's already a video series on that. But this turned out to be probably the most smooth process that I experienced with costume making up to that point. It was the easiest to make. It was good. It ended up being a nice, comfortable fit, and it ended up being comfortable because I put a soft fabric on the inside to line the foam. That being said, I ended up kind of messing this one up because you can see here the initial paint job and coloring job, which was perfectly fine, but then I got dissatisfied with it, and I went through a whole bunch of different color schemes trying to satisfy myself. And then when I finally ended up back on the red and black, then it made all the paint I had put on it just made it too stiff and it didn't fit anymore. So that's why I've ended up having to build a new costume. I didn't really fully realize it at the time, but I was also going through a bit of a depression, and that kind of I let that kind of cloud how I saw things. So I kind of regret doing that, but at the same time, with the new costume I'm taking a new approach that should hopefully be a bit better and more efficient and more economic, so I can do more monsters and have more opponent monsters in the future. So these are some early stage photographs for the newest costume I'm building, which is made from a base of disposable coveralls. Uh, for the hands, I'm going to be using some reusable rubber kitchen gloves with some uh, fingertips added to it to make them look like claws. There's going to be a pool noodle that's going to be used for the tail with an EVA foam tip added to it to make it look a little dragon like. All the special parts like the head and the scales and fins and such are going to be made out of EVA foam that I bought from TNT Cosplay Supply. The head is purple in these photos because I wanted to try that color scheme, and even though I liked it, it's going to end up being red and yellow instead because I found the purple just would not chroma properly. Like it wouldn't key out against blue screen properly. It would always get lost in the background. So red is going to be the color of choice for now. So the reason I'm going this way with it this time is because I'm trying to find a method of creating these monsters that is more economic and more efficient and more storage friendly because the foam costumes really are not all that storage friendly. They take up a lot of space. And so if you're intending on making opponents who are also monster costumes, then you're going to run out of space pretty quickly. So the goal with this is to have something which can be kind of folded up to a certain extent, or maybe even hung in a closet or something like that, so you can fit more monsters into your studio. Another thing is to try to have the costumes feel a little more disposable as opposed to putting in all this work into it where it feels like a masterpiece work of art and then they just fall apart and there's very little you can do about it. So it needs to feel more like how probably a big studio feels about disposing of their monster costumes, which they don't really seem to care that much until these days when they can use them for publicity and events and things like that. So it's just trying to get a more rational way of doing it to where it's like more suitable for a yearly monster movie format or something like that. It's going a bit slowly right now because I'm trying to take my time and get things the way I want it to, so I won't be doing things after the fact. But I'm hoping that after I get the techniques down, making things this way will be a lot quicker. And that's all the Gamaeyong costumes I've made in the past 10 years. It's been a very long process of trial and error and learning and trying different things and hopefully getting onto a slightly more sane track. Hopefully, there will be many more to come, but I figured I'd do something a little special for the 10th anniversary, which is this May 5th. And hopefully you got something out of it too. So for now, this is Benjamin Kennedy signing off.